Now, since these are all second year topics, you shouldn't find it that hard. I think you still have it fresh in your memory. Which of the following, the first question says, which of the following pairs contains an infectious and a non-infectious disease? So the correct answer is option B. Now here you know that AIDS is caused by a virus, so it's infectious, it is transmitted. It can get transmitted from one person to another, and that's why it is called infectious disease. Whereas you know that cancer is a non-infectious disease. You cannot contract cancer from an infected person. So AIDS and cancer, one of it is infectious and one of it is non-infectious disease. Now, which of the following statements regarding the disease typhoid? So typhoid is also commonly called enteric fever. You know that. It mostly targets your digestive tract. It mostly targets your alimentary canal or the digestive tract. So the first statement says it is caused by Salmonella typhi. This is absolutely right. You know that the bacteria causing typhoid is Salmonella typhi. It is a pathogen that enters the human intestine through contaminated food and water. This is also correct. And it migrates to other organs through blood. This is also correct. So the entire first sentence is right. So let us see what is the second sentence here. Sustained high fever. So they're talking about the symptoms of typhoid. Sustained high fever, weakness, stomach pain, constipation, headache, loss of appetite. Yes, all of these are the classical symptoms of enteric fever or typhoid. The third option says typhoid vaccine is available as DPT. Now, this is the wrong statement. Why is this statement wrong? Because DPT vaccine does not include typhoid. DPT includes diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus. It is called the triple antigen vaccine, isn't it? Because you're vaccinating a person against three antigens, against three pathogens. One is diphtheria, one is pertussis, and one is tetanus. Typhoid vaccine, if at all it is given, typhoid vaccine is given separately. It doesn't come under this category of DPT vaccine. Generally for typhoid vaccine, it is a killed vaccine. The killed form of this bacteria, the Salmonella typhi bacteria, is introduced into the blood of a person, into the body of a person to develop immunity against it. This fourth option says the patient of this disease is not required to be treated with antibiotics. This is also wrong. The reason this is wrong is because, first of all, typhoid is a bacterial disease. And whenever you want to target a bacterial infection, you would want to use antibiotics. But here it's saying it is not required to be treated with antibiotics. So it is not true. Obviously, the first line of treatment would be administering antibiotics because antibiotics are very powerful and they're very potent against bacteria. So third and fourth statements are incorrect, whereas the first and the second statements are correct. Blood culture is more effective. Yes, this is also a correct statement. See, not always is Widal test performed in order to detect typhoid. In very, very, very rare cases, Widal test may give a false negative. The person might have typhoid causing bacteria in his system, but it may not show up in the blood, and the person may show it may show as a negative under Widal test. So under such conditions, what they do is they carry out culture test. In culture test, what you're doing is you're actually culturing the microorganism in the lab. You're obtaining a biological sample, you're inoculating it onto a culture medium, onto a culture dish, like how you would do tissue culture, like how you inoculate the explant onto a culture medium. Just like that, you introduce the tissue sample, say the blood sample into the tissue, into the culture medium, and the bacteria starts growing over there. And you can observe these bacteria by staining them under the microscope. So blood culture is much more easier to be. You can detect something more easily through blood culture than just probably conducting a Widal test. However, your PU they will ask you which is the diagnostic test for typhoid. 1 mark question they will ask you. So Widal is the diagnostic test for typhoid. Which one of the following is a mismatched pair of drug and its effect? So here you have different categories of drugs, as you can see. The first category is amphetamine. Now, amphetamine belongs to the same category of drug as cocaine. You know what we call cocaine and amphetamines? We call them as stimulants. They have a stimulating effect on the nervous system. So I think the first combination is perfect. Amphetamine and cocaine are excellent examples for stimulants. There are some other additional examples also, if you can remember. There is another drug which belongs to this category of stimulant. It is also called ecstasy. Now, ecstasy is abbreviated as MDMA. It is said to be a chemically somewhat similar to amphetamine. Okay, so the full form of MDMA is methylene dioxymethamphetamine. See, it's a methylated form of amphetamine. So methamphetamine it is called. So three drugs you can remember under CNS stimulants. One is cocaine, one is amphetamine, and one is methylene dioxymethamphetamine, that is MDMA, which is together referred to as CNS stimulants. They have an excitatory effect on your nervous system. So generally a person who has consumed coke, or I hope you know that cocaine is also called coke or crack, it's mentioned in your NCERT. So when a person is under the influence of coke or crack, the person feels an intense euphoria. There's a high, and then after that there's a crash. Crash means the person falls into. So this intense euphoric feeling is because of the stimulation. The nervous system is stimulated by these drugs, and it doesn't last for a long time. So what happens is after a while, the person again gets into deep depression, and that is called crash. So the intense high is followed by deep depression, that is called crash. It is also good for you to remember some of the names by which amphetamine is known as. So amphetamine is known by, the common name for amphetamine is called speed, or it is commonly referred to as meth. Specifically, the methylated form of amphetamine, that is called methamphetamine, it's simply called as meth. Then it is also sometimes referred to as Dexys, sometimes it is called Bennies, and sometimes it is called uppers. So these are some of the common terms associated with amphetamine. Rarely you get such questions, but anyway, it's good to know that there are alternate terms also. Very famous names for amphetamine include speed and meth. Okay, so the first option is absolutely right. The second option, that is LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, they're calling it a psychedelic or a hallucinogen. That is also correct, actually. So anything that alters your sensations, alters your thoughts, alters your perception, that makes a person who is under the influence of these drugs probably hallucinate, hear things or see things, see flashes of lights and see colors and halo around objects and all that. That is called a hallucinogen. Now, very important is, where is this LSD derived from? Lysergic acid diethylamide. It is actually derived from a group of alkaloids called ergot alkaloids from a fungus. The name of the fungus is Claviceps purpurea. So Claviceps purpurea is a fungus, and they don't obtain it directly from that fungus. You obtain this ergot alkaloid, and this ergot alkaloid is later subjected to certain chemical reactions in the lab. And then you obtain this modified form, this changed, altered form, which is referred to as lysergic acid diethylamide. Okay, so basically the final product is obtained by chemical synthesis in the lab, but the raw material for this is a group of chemicals which are present in a fungus called Claviceps purpurea, and these chemicals are referred to as the ergot alkaloids. Okay, so this is also correct. And then you know about depressants, heroin, all the opioids. So opioids are collectively referred to as depressants because they are, to be very precise, they are CNS depressants because they slow down the body function. The reason they are called depressants is because they have an effect on, they kind of slow down the metabolism, they slow down the bodily activities, bodily functions, they induce a sense of calmness, a sense of relaxation. All negative emotions disappear. There's no anxiety, there's no tension, there's no guilt. All these emotions disappear. That's why it's called a CNS depressant. In opioids, we usually in the NCRT, what they've done is they've called heroin as also smack. And you know that sometimes it is also called brown sugar. And actually, heroin is a modified form of another drug called morphine, isn't it? It is called diacetyl morphine. So when you carry out acetylation of morphine, morphine is actually present in the fruit of that plant, opium plant, poppy plant, Papaver somniferum. And from that morphine, by acetylating that morphine, you can obtain this chemical called diacetyl morphine, which is called heroin or smack or brown sugar. So it is also a depressant. That is fine. I want you all to read from the NCRT. What are the targets of opioids? Then they act on receptors, opioid receptors that are located in the central nervous system, opioid receptors that are also located in your gastrointestinal tract. And what is their chemical nature? Are they crystalline? Are they amorphous? Are they colored? Are they colorless? How do they taste? So they are bitter in taste apparently. So these are all the things mentioned in your NCRT. So make sure you become thorough with this. So heroin, 3 things you need to remember under opioids: morphine, heroin. And heroin is also a modified form of morphine, that is diacetyl morphine. And morphine, the addiction to morphine is called soldier's disease. That's because the earlier times in the war and all that, soldiers would get wounded in the war field, in the battlefield, and they would be given injections of morphine because it relieves pain. So even after surgery, to overcome post-surgical pain, morphine is given. So therefore, soldiers would become addicted. There is an a component of addiction associated with intake of morphine. So that's why sometimes addiction to morphine is also referred to as soldier's disease. Then which is the wrong one? The last one, it says, is wrong. What is wrong with the last one? A group of drugs. Actually, these barbiturates are also coming under the category of CNS depressants. Just a minute, children. I'll be back in a minute. Okay, so barbiturates also come under the category of CNS depressants, although this has not been dealt with in your textbook. So they only talk about opioids as CNS depressants, but please remember barbiturates also have a suppressing effect on your nervous system. Barbiturates are not tranquilizers, are something that will instantly put you to a state of unconsciousness. So barbiturates are not tranquilizers. Barbiturates are called downers, or we can also call them as hypnotics, or we can call them as sedatives. They induce a state of mild sleep. Sedation, it is called. Tranquilizer is something that will totally make you unconscious. So which is a tranquilizer then? Barbiturate is not a tranquilizer. For a tranquilizer, you need to remember another group of drugs, which is called benzodiazepines. Now, these benzodiazepines are commonly called the sleeping pills. And these are tranquilizers. Okay, so these are usually used to make a person, that's mostly, say for example, a person with psychotic behavior. You want to put that person to immediate, you want to make him unconscious. So that time, these benzodiazepines are used. So barbiturates are downers or hypnotics or sedatives, and benzodiazepines are tranquilizers. Both barbiturates and benzodiazepines belong to the same category of drugs as your opium as well as opioids. So we have these drugs which are referred to as CNS depressants. Okay. The common cold virus is, so which is the common cold virus among all of them? Obviously, you know that common cold is a viral disease. So it is caused by rhinovirus. Rhino refers to upper respiratory tract, especially your nasal cavity. You know that common cold infection is restricted to your UTR, upper respiratory tract, isn't it? But it is not something which affects your lungs. You don't necessarily have a lung congestion when you're suffering from common cold. It is mostly the upper respiratory tract that is affected. Streptococcus pneumonia is pneumonia. Salmonella typhi murium or Salmonella typhi is typhoid. Plasmodium vivax is nothing but malaria. During the life cycle of Plasmodium, sexual reproduction takes place in which of the following hosts? So you should recall that in malaria, the parasite life cycle, there are two hosts. Man is the primary host and female Anopheles mosquito is the secondary host. The parasite Plasmodium undergoes asexual cycle in man. It does not undergo sexual cycle in man. And it undergoes sexual cycle in female Anopheles mosquito. As you all are aware, the asexual cycle first happens in the liver and then it happens in the RBC. And what do we call this asexual cycle? This asexual cycle is called the schizogony, the name given to the asexual multiple fission that happens inside the liver cell, and the daughter parasites burst the liver cells and release out. Same thing happens in the RBCs also. The parasite divides into many daughter cells, and then the RBC will burst open and the daughter parasites will come out. This asexual reproduction is called schizogony. Whereas in the mosquito, in the female Anopheles mosquito, especially in the gut or in the intestine of the mosquito, you all must remember that fertilization of this parasite takes place. Actually, the parasite forms male gamete and female gamete inside the body of the mosquito, in the gut or the intestine of the mosquito. Once the male and the female gamete are formed, they both undergo fusion. This fusion is called gametogony. Formation of gametes and its fertilization in the stomach or in the gut or the intestine of the female Anopheles mosquito. First of all, you should remember for fertilization to happen, you need a male gamete, you need a female gamete. That means the parasite has sexual stages in its life cycle. The sexual stages give rise to the male gamete and the female gamete respectively, and the gametes fuse together in the gut or the intestine. That is called gametogony. After this fertilization happens, in the stomach only, the last process happens. It is called sporogony. Now, in this sporogony, the infective stages are generated. So what do we call the infected stages? Generation of the sporozoites. So if a female Anopheles mosquito bites us, and if it introduces these sporozoites into our blood, only then we will suffer from malaria. So these sporozoites, which is injected by the infected female Anopheles mosquito, These sporozoites are referred to as the infective stages. Okay, so fertilization followed by sporogony, and then these sporozoites which are formed in the stomach. See, basically all this is happening in the gut of the mosquito. So fertilization also happens in the gut of the mosquito. Sporogony also happens in the gut wall of the mosquito in order to generate these tiny parasites called sporozoites. But these sporozoites will not stay in the gut. They will swim to the salivary glands. Why should they swim all the way to the salivary glands? Because when the mosquito bites a healthy man, they have to enter into the body of that man. So they have to reach a point in the body of the mosquito where they can get inoculated into the blood. So along with the blood meal, these parasites are slipped into the blood during the blood meal of a mosquito. That's why these sporozoites are sitting in the salivary glands of the infected female Anopheles mosquito. They are formed in the gut and they swim all the way to the salivary. Okay, so schizogony is what happens in man. Gametogony is what happens in the gut, involving the process of fertilization. Followed by fertilization, once the zygote is formed, the remaining stages are called sporogony. Sporogony actually happens in the wall of the gut. In the wall of the gut, the zygote gets embedded in the wall of the gut, and there the sporogony happens, where it generates these infective stages which are called sporozoites. Okay, so these are some of the important timelines, time points you need to remember. When, where, what happens. So basically, first that happens here, the first target is liver cell in man. The second target is RBC. And then they enter into the sexual phase. A lot of questions will be based on the flow chart given in your textbook. So please go through that entire cycle of the life cycle of Plasmodium. That gives you the details of how the parasite is entering the liver cell. The liver cell bursts open, daughter parasites come out, and they attack RBCs. RBCs burst open, again they come out. And then they stop dividing in the RBCs after a while. They become sexual stages. Those sexual stages are called gametocytes. And now they're waiting for a mosquito to come by. And then they get swallowed by the mosquito. And then in the stomach of the mosquito, in the gut of the mosquito, the remaining processes take place. They undergo fertilization, followed by sporogony, release of sporozoites, which reach the salivary glands of the mosquito. And then when such a mosquito bites a healthy man, it's going to inoculate them with the parasites. Amoebic dysentery, just like Plasmodium. What is the relationship between Plasmodium and entamoebiasis? Both are protozoan diseases. Plasmodium is also a protozoan only, and amoebic dysentery is also caused by a protozoan disease. Protozoan pathogen called entamoebiasis. It's also called entamoebiasis, and it is caused by Entamoeba histolytica. There is no host in this. There is no vector for this disease. Of course, mechanical vectors are there. For example, houseflies can act as mechanical vectors. But there's no vector like how for malaria there is mosquito acting as a vector, where within the body of the mosquito a very integral part of the parasite's life cycle is completed. That kind of a vector is not there. So we usually call such parasites as monogenetic. Monogenetic means only one host. Okay. Appearance of dry, scaly lesions with itching on various parts of the body are the symptoms of the disease. It's a fungal disease. So you all know that the fungal disease we are talking about here is the ringworm disease. And you all know that ringworm disease is sometimes called tinea. And depending on which part of the body they affect, it's called by different names. For example, if it affects the foot, then it is called tinea pedis. If it affects the head or the scalp, it is called tinea cruris or crura. Sorry, capitis, not cruris. Tinea capitis. And then what if it affects the genital region, or the right word here is the groinal region? Then we call it as tinea cruris. And what if it is the bearded part of the face, the facial skin? Then it is tinea barbae. So in general, the ringworm infection is simply called tinea, and it affects different parts of the body, like I have mentioned over here. The first one is called athlete's foot, tinea pedis, which affects the folds of your skin between your toes, mostly the last toe, between the last toe and the fourth toe. That's where mostly, and you're mostly covering your feet with socks and your footwear, and therefore there's a lot of heat and moisture over there. So these fungi require a lot of heat and moisture, and it is contagious also. It can spread from one person to another through touch. Okay, so the different parts and the respective disease: tinea pedis, tinea capitis, tinea cruris, and tinea barbae. Elephantiasis is a chronic inflammation that results in gross deformities caused by. So elephantiasis is a helminth disease, and it is caused by what kind of a helminth? Is it a flatworm or a roundworm? Wuchereria bancrofti and Wuchereria malayi, both of them are roundworms. They're not flatworms. So in general, we can simply call them as helminth disease. Okay, and in helminth disease, you also have to remember what kind of treatment is offered. Mostly, some questions have been asked about this. So mostly for elephantiasis, sometimes it is also simply referred to as filariasis. Elephantiasis or filariasis also it is called. So how is this disease treated? Two major drugs are administered here. One is called alcopar and one is called diethyl carbamazine. Too commonly, this diethyl carbamazine is also sometimes referred to as hetrazane. So two common medications that are offered that a person who is suffering from, although this is not some disease that can easily be treated, it more or less becomes a condition. It mostly attacks the lymphatic system, as you all are aware. The lymphatic system of the lower limbs and of the genital region. And it becomes a chronic condition that the person has to live with for the rest of his or her life. Although to maintain or to probably to manage the disease, drugs like alcopar and diethyl carbamazine are administered. Which of the following does not participate in innate immunity? Neutrophil, macrophages, and natural killer cells are all part of innate immunity. Don't forget, they're all part of cellular barriers. In innate immunity, first of all, innate immunity, as you all know, it is also called non-specific immunity. Why is it called non-specific immunity? Because it acts against a wide range of pathogens. It is not specific to a particular pathogen. And the reason why it is called innate immunity is it is something that is a part and parcel of our anatomical makeup. It is present from the time of birth, except B lymphocyte, because B lymphocyte is a part of acquired immunity. Acquired immunity has different names. We can either call it as acquired immunity or adaptive immunity, or we can call it as specific immunity. Under acquired immunity or adaptive or specific immunity, you have a type of response, a mechanism that is called humoral immune response. These are types of mechanisms of acquired or adaptive or specific immunity. Under humoral immunity or humoral immune response, you have these B lymphocytes. B lymphocytes are born in your bone marrow and they mature in your bone marrow only. They don't go to any other organ to mature. They are born and they mature in your bone marrow. And what else I wanted to tell you about B lymphocyte? B lymphocytes are the ones which secrete antibodies. Not directly though. Once they are activated by antigen, the B lymphocytes, let me simply call it a B cell. It differentiates and proliferates and differentiates into another group of cells called plasma cells. And these plasma cells are the ones that secrete antibodies. So generally they don't ask about plasma cells. They will say just which of the following cells secrete antibodies. There's nothing wrong in saying B lymphocytes secrete antibodies. But you should remember that they don't directly secrete antibodies. When they encounter an antigen, they get activated, they start proliferating rapidly, and they differentiate into two populations of cells. Some of them are called plasma cells and some of them are called memory cells. There needs to be a reserve, no, in case there is a future, in case in the future, again, the same pathogen attacks your body. So among these two categories, which the B cells differentiate into, the plasma cells are the ones that secrete these antibodies. And you know that neutrophils are also called PMNL, polymorphonuclear leukocytes. Another thing you know that these neutrophils, macrophages, and natural killer cells, they all belong to what? They all belong to cellular barriers. Cellular barriers and another family of chemicals called cytokine barriers. These two barriers are called the second line of defense. The first line of defense is your skin and mucous membrane. Your skin that does not allow any microorganism to easily enter into your internal environment. And the slimy layer, the mucus layer, which lines your respiratory system, your excretory urinogenital system, your digestive system, everything is lined on the inside by mucous membrane. That is the first line of defense. The remaining parts in the innate immunity, that is cellular barrier and cytokine barrier, are second line of defense. And this acquired or adaptive immunity is the third line of defense. So they may ask you, which is the third line of defense? So the specific immunity or acquired immunity or adaptive immunity, they are referred to as the third line of defense. The term immunity refers to, very basic question, very simple. The term immunity refers to ability of the host body to fight against a disease-causing organism. Any disease-causing agent which elicits a kind of a negative response in the body, which negatively affects our body, is called as a pathogen. And when we have the ability to fight against the pathogen, it's called immunity. The first line of defense, I already told you, skin and mucous membrane is the first line of defense. Everything else under the second line of defense. See, inflammatory response is also coming under cytokine only. Complement also, you know that there are a set of proteins which carry out a chain reaction. Ultimately, the goal of complement system is to form MAC. What is MAC? They form something called membrane attack complex. And you know what this membrane attack complex does? This membrane attack complex is formed on the membrane of a foreign agent, of an antigen, and it will punch a hole in the membrane. And once a hole has been punched in the membrane of a bacterial cell or a membrane of a fungal cell, or you're punching a hole in the protein capsid of a virus, obviously it's going to get the contents of its are going to pour out, and the cell is going to die. So the ultimate goal of complement system, a group of tiny proteins which carry out a series of chain reactions. The ultimate goal is to punch hole in the membrane of the foreign agent or the pathogen by forming a complex called MAC, membrane attack complex. All these come under second line of defense. Except the skin and mucous membrane, everything else under innate immunity is second line of defense. And which is the other one I told you, third line of defense is a whole new type of immunity, that is acquired or adaptive or specific immunity. The genetic material of HIV, you know that HIV is a retrovirus. And why HIV is called as a retrovirus? Because it has a single-stranded RNA as its genetic material. And once this single-stranded RNA enters into the host, all of you know that the single-stranded RNA is converted into double-stranded DNA. And this process where a single-stranded RNA is converted into double-stranded DNA is called reverse transcription, and it is mediated by an enzyme carried by the virus itself. The virus only carries this enzyme. That enzyme is called reverse transcriptase. So obviously the genetic, and sometimes very rarely they call HIV as diploid also. Don't get confused, they don't have chromosomes and all that. The only reason HIV is sometimes referred to as diploid is because it has two copies of, the viral particle has two copies of single-stranded RNA. So each viral particle inside its core of proteins, it has two single-stranded RNA copies that are present. That's why sometimes they also call it as diploid. The most abundant antibody produced against allergy. IgE is the antibody that is produced against allergy. It is very, very less. Otherwise, both IgE and IgD, they make up for less than 1% of all the antibodies present in your blood. Least abundant there, but they become very high in levels, especially when you're facing an allergic response.